please let me welcome to the stage Mr. Timothy Good.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Yes? Excellent. Can we have the first slide, please? One of the enduring myths about the UFO subject is that it all started in the United States on the 24th of June with Kenneth Arnold, who saw flying saucers in Washington State. It didn't start with Kenneth Arnold. He didn't see flying saucers. He saw crescent-shaped objects, which later became known as flying saucers or flying discs. It's also generally accepted that Roswell was the first retrieval of an alleged alien vehicle. It wasn't. There were several in World War II, several in various parts of the world, including New Mexico in 1945, Missouri in 1940, apparently. It's also a myth that governments began official investigations in 1947. They didn't. They started in 1933. In Italy and Sweden, as a matter of fact. If we can have the next slide. Okay, they'll try and sharpen these things up. This is an interesting report. That's better. Dating back to June 1933. It's been authenticated. It's a highly confidential telegram from the Director of Special Affairs, and it states, on the personal order of Il Duce, that's Mussolini, absolutely no mention is to be made of the alleged landing of an unknown craft on national soil. Maximum penalty for non-compliance will be enforced by the Tribunal for State Security. And the Italians, in fact, under Mussolini, set up a top-secret special research group, number 33. And Mussolini presided. He was very interested in the subject, himself being a pilot. And it was also directed by Marconi, the famous engineer. And there were a number of astronomers and various dignitaries who headed this top-secret group. Next, please. That's just a Japanese Navy photograph of UFOs taken in the Pacific during World War II. The so-called Foo Fighters are often referred to as amorphous blobs, if controlled or semi-controlled. But really, there were many other reports of other kinds of UFO reported by pilots and others during the Second World War. Let's go to the next slide. You won't be able to read any of that for the time being. Sharpen up some of it. It relates to, it's a Ministry of Defense report, classified secret at the time and declassified a few years ago. It relates to the sighting by the crew of a Lancaster bomber who claimed to have seen a large object traveling at about 500 miles an hour on one occasion. And there was another sighting by the same crew of this Lancaster bomber over Amsterdam of a craft which was seen on the ground at first and later maneuvering at high speed. Again, these weren't amorphous blobs. They were apparently solidly controlled machines. Next slide, please. The Lancaster bomber was the most used of the heavy bombers by the Royal Air Force in the Second World War, and I suppose the American equivalent for the US Army Air Forces would be the B-17 Flying Fortress. For the first time, I've published in my new book an extraordinary report by a radio radar operator on board a Lancaster in 1944. Now, they were coming back. If we can have the next slide, please. The crew was returning from a bombing trip over France, and they had been the lead bomber. Suddenly, the radio navigator noticed that the screen went blank, and the captain suddenly shouted, "What the hell is that?" So the navigator, radar operator, went up into the Astrodome, which had a 360-degree view. And he saw an enormous string of lights that it seemed like miles in length. And then he said a grey saucer-like object emerged as part of the lights. Can we have the next slide, please? This is not a photograph, unfortunately. It's a sketch by this radio radar observer of this enormous object. And this is how he described it. Our Lancaster was a large aeroplane, but the only comparison I can make is that we were but a dot on a sheet of foolscap paper. After 3 minutes, it shot away at phenomenal speed, and the crew was left with an extraordinary feeling of calmness, which they were completely at a loss to explain. When they landed at their base at RAF Oakington in Cambridgeshire, they were astonished that there was a great deal more of the normal intelligence officers for the debriefing, and they weren't remotely interested in the bombing raid. They wanted to know about the flying saucer. That was 1944, so they weren't just Foo Fighters in the 1940s during World War II. There were many large objects seen. Next slide, please. This is Commander Jean Kisling of the Free French Air Force on a detachment at Selfridge Field, Michigan. He was an instructor on P-47D and P-47N Thunderbolt fighters, and he's shown here at Oscoda in Michigan in 1944. He tells me that in July of 1945, there were sightings of what the military thought were the Japanese Fugo balloons, many of which were coming over at that time, mostly on the West Coast, but some made it as far as Michigan. And they were seen over the Selfridge Field base, Army Air Force's base. So the commander of the base asked for a volunteer to go and shoot down the Japanese balloons. Now, I know the American government's none too happy with the French for their failure to participate in the Iraqi war, but be it known that a Frenchman was the first to volunteer for the mission to protect America from what they thought were Japanese invaders. Anyway, Kisling took off. He went to the maximum height, the maximum service ceiling that his plane could reach. He managed to get one of these balloons in sight, and it looked spherical at first. And then he managed to get it in his gun sights, and 8, I think, 50 caliber machine guns converged on it as far as he knew. He started firing, and suddenly this thing flipped on edge to a disc and shot off at a phenomenal speed. And at that point, as he was telling me this, he said, "I realized it was no balloon,